October 27, 1962, the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war. For 13 days the US and Soviet Union faced off in a deadly standoff, but the real danger wasn't in Washington or Moscow, it was deep beneath the Atlantic. A Soviet submarine, B-59, was trapped, its crew isolated and terrified. They believed war had already begun. Above them, American warships hunted relentlessly, dropping sonar pings and depth charges. The submarine's captain, convinced the motherland was under attack, prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. The weapon could have triggered a global nuclear exchange. The world was oblivious to this underwater drama. On land, people hoped for peace, unaware that the fate of billions rested on 3 men in a steel tube. The line between peace and annihilation was razor thin, drawn by fear and misunderstanding. In the sweltering, claustrophobic submarine, the decision to end the world was about to be made, not by presidents, but by exhausted, frightened men. The air was thick with sweat and diesel. The silence from Moscow was deafening. The captain's finger hovered over the button. The world was one decision away from Armageddon, and the man, with the power to destroy everything, was about to make his choice. 13 minutes would decide the fate of humanity. The clock was ticking. To understand those 13 minutes, we must look at the world of 1962. The Cold War split the planet in two, with the US and Soviet Union locked in a nuclear arms race, mutually assured destruction. MAD meant any attack would guarantee total annihilation. The crisis began when US spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. President Kennedy responded with a naval quarantine, stopping Soviet ships from reaching Cuba. The world watched as the superpowers edged closer to war. Soviet Premier Khrushchev refused to back down. Tensions soared. Families built fallout shelters. Schools ran nuclear drills. Meanwhile, the US Navy hunted Soviet submarines near Cuba. 4 Foxtrot-class subs, each armed with a nuclear torpedo, lurked in the Atlantic. The Americans didn't know these subs carried nuclear weapons. The Soviets' orders were vague. Use the special weapon only if attacked and cut off from command. In the fog of war, attack became a deadly gray area. The stage was set for disaster beneath the waves. The fate of the world would soon hinge on a single submarine and a single fateful decision. Life on B-59 was hellish. Built for the Arctic, the subsystems failed in the Caribbean heat. Temperatures soared above 50°. Air was thick with fumes. 70 men crammed into a space the size of a small house, rationed to a glass of water a day. The psychological strain was worse than the physical. Cut off from Moscow, the crew had no idea if war had started. The constant sonar pings from American ships felt like torture. Captain Savitsky, under immense pressure, believed they were already at war. The lack of information bred paranoia. Every creak of the hull sounded like doom. The men believed they might be the last defenders of a destroyed homeland. In this vacuum, fear and exhaustion warped reality. The world's fate was about to be decided in the darkness below. October 27th, Black Saturday. The crisis peaked. The USS Beale found B-59 in the Sargasso Sea. American ships dropped practice depth charges, signaling the sub to surface. But the B-59 crew didn't know this protocol. To them, the explosions meant war had begun. Lights flickered, the hull shook. Panic spread. Captain Savitsky, convinced they were under attack, ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared. The weapon could obliterate the American fleet and trigger all-out war. The Americans had no idea how close they were to disaster. One launch would have meant nuclear retaliation on both sides. The world's fate hung by a thread, dependent on a decision made in a sweltering, shaking submarine. Misunderstanding and fear had brought humanity to the brink. The next moments would decide everything. Would the world end in fire, or be saved by reason? The control room of B-59 was a pressure cooker. Captain Savitsky and the political officer agreed. Launch the nuclear torpedo. Only one thing stood in their way. Vasili Arkhipov, the flotilla's chief of staff. On this sub, all 3 senior officers had to agree to launch. Arkhipov refused. An argument erupted as explosions rocked the sub. Savitsky shouted for action. Arkhipov insisted on caution. He questioned the logic. Why would Americans use small charges if they wanted to destroy them? Arkhipov urged patience. arguing the signals were a demand to surface, not an attack. For 13 agonizing minutes, the fate of the world hung on a shouting match. Arkipov's calm and reason clashed with panic and fear. The crew waited breathless as the officers argued. The nuclear torpedo sat ready. The world's future depended on Arkipov's resolve. Finally, his logic prevailed. The order to launch was rescinded. Instead, B-59 surfaced. The world had been saved by a single steadfast no. Vasili Arkhipov was no ordinary officer. He'd survived a nuclear accident before and knew the true horror of atomic war. In the chaos, he remained calm, refusing to launch without clear evidence. He argued, starting World War III on a guess would be madness. His authority as flotilla commander gave his refusal weight. He suggested surfacing and awaiting orders instead. Savitsky, furious, finally relented. B-59 surfaced, met by American ships. There was no violence, just exhausted men, relieved to be alive. The submarine turned for home. The immediate crisis was over. The world had been pulled back from the brink by Arkipov's courage. Sometimes history turns on the calm judgment of a single person. Imagine if Arkhipov hadn't been there. The nuclear torpedo would have launched, vaporizing the USS Randolph and its crew. The US would have retaliated with overwhelming nuclear force. The Soviet Union would have responded in kind. Cities across the globe, New York, Moscow, London, reduced to rubble. Hundreds of millions dead within hours. Nuclear winter would follow, agriculture collapsing, survivors left in a radioactive wasteland. Civilization as we know it would have ended, all averted by one man's refusal to give in to panic. 13 minutes, one word, no. The world was saved by the courage and sanity of a single officer. Sometimes, the fate of humanity rests on a single choice. The B-59 incident reveals the limits of technology and protocol. Cold War systems were designed to prevent accidental launches, but they nearly failed. In the fog of war, fear and exhaustion can overwhelm even the best-trained officers. Captain Savitsky wasn't evil. He was a man pushed to the edge by stress and isolation. The system gave him immense power, but not enough information. Arkipov's human judgment made the difference. He questioned assumptions, imagined alternatives, and chose caution. But relying on a single hero is not a safe strategy. On other subs, only 2 officers' consent was needed. Disaster could have struck. The line between control and catastrophe is razor thin. In a nuclear crisis, there is no room for error. The lesson systems must be robust, but humanity's judgment remains essential. We must never forget how close we came. When B-59 returned home, its crew was not celebrated. Their story remained secret for decades. Vasili Arkhipov continued his career quietly, his heroism unknown. Only years later did the world learn how close we came to destruction, and who saved us. Arkipov's legacy is profound. The man who saved the world with a single act of conscience. His story proves that history can hinge on the courage of one person. Today, thousands of nuclear weapons still exist. New risks, cyber warfare, AI, make miscalculation ever more dangerous. Arkipov's example reminds us, technology can't replace human judgment. We must foster cultures of caution and critical thinking in our most sensitive institutions. The lesson of October 1962 is clear. Humanity's future depends on reason, restraint, and the courage to say no. Vasili Arkhipov gave us a second chance. Let's ensure no one ever faces such a choice again.